You need to watch this if you crave chills down your spine. Welcome to Soul Studios. Here, true crime meets the unknown. Suspense lurks in every shadow and supernatural forces whisper from the dark. We craft chilling, edge-of-your-seat short stories inspired by the eerie, the unexplained, and the most haunting mysteries. 3 new stories drop every week, each one darker than the last. Are you ready to step inside? Subscribe now before the next story finds you.
What if a birthday gift held the key to solving a decades-old mystery? In Lullaby of the Lost, Emily receives a beautiful vintage music box, only to discover it plays a haunting melody on its own. And it's not just music coming from within. As strange events unravel, she uncovers the tragic disappearance of a young girl from 1975, a secret long buried beneath her small town, and a chilling connection to the box itself. With time running out and a restless spirit crying for justice, Emily must face the darkness to bring peace to the past. If you love supernatural thrillers, haunted mysteries, and emotional twists, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell so you never miss a story from SOL Studios. Emily Bennett stepped out of the bright summer sunlight and into May's diner, the door's brass bell jingling above her. The cool air inside smelled of fried potatoes and cherry pie, a comforting mix of grease and sugar. She paused a moment, letting her eyes adjust from the glare. Inside, the diner was all warm amber light and scuffed checkerboard floors. The hum of conversation and clatter of dishes filled her ears, a familiar soundtrack in this small town of Willow Creek. Sliding into a red vinyl booth by the window, Emily ran a hand through her chestnut-brown hair, which was still warm from the sun. Outside on Main Street, the July heat shimmered. Through the glass, she noted the familiar small-town sights, an elderly couple shuffling past the general store and a kid whizzing by on a bicycle with a playing card clattering in the spokes. Willow Creek's summer rhythm was slow and familiar. Everyone knew everyone, comforting and a little stifling at once. She glanced down at the table where a vanilla milkshake sat sweating in its tall glass, a cherry bobbing on top. Across from her, Jake Lawson was already digging into a basket of fries. He was her childhood friend, now home from college for the summer, just like she was. His sandy hair fell into his eyes as he looked up with a grin, offering the basket. "Want some? They're best hot," he said. Emily popped a fry into her mouth, the salt and heat dancing on her tongue. "Thanks. I didn't realize how hungry I was," she replied, her voice half drowned by the tinny pop song playing on the jukebox in the corner. The sweet vanilla of the milkshake lingered on her lips, and the fry's salty crunch was the perfect counterpoint. Jake wiped his fingers on a napkin and leaned back. "Happy belated birthday, by the way," he said, a playful glint in his eyes. Emily's 22nd birthday had been a week ago, but Jake had been away visiting family. "I know I'm late, but I got you something." She raised an eyebrow, intrigued, as he reached down to the seat beside him and lifted up a small gift-wrapped box. The wrapping paper was shiny purple, topped with a slightly squashed silver bow, as if he'd wrapped it himself in a hurry. Emily felt a flutter of anticipation. She loved surprises, and Jake always had a knack for thoughtful gifts. "You didn't have to get me anything," she said softly, though a smile tugged at her lips. She accepted the gift, feeling the smooth paper under her fingertips, and carefully unwrapped it. Beneath the paper was a polished wooden box, about the size of a jewellery case. The wood was rich cherry, carved with delicate floral patterns. A tiny brass latch kept it closed. "Oh, it's beautiful," Emily breathed. She ran a finger over the carvings, tracing the whorls and petals. The wood felt cool and silky, and it carried a faint scent of old varnish and something floral like dried rose petals. "Is it a jewellery box?" Jake's grin widened. "Open it." Emily lifted the latch and gently raised the lid. At once, a soft, tinkling melody began to play. A miniature ballerina figurine sprung up inside, spinning slowly on one toe. The tune was gentle and eerily familiar, a lullaby she remembered from childhood. The delicate notes of Brahms's lullaby chimed out from the hidden mechanism. Despite the warmth of the day, Emily felt a small shiver dance across her skin. Something about the melody made her chest tighten with a strange emotion, equal parts comfort and melancholy. A music box. "Jake, it's lovely." She watched the ballerina twirl in front of a tiny oval mirror inside the lid. The mirror's surface was speckled and tarnished with age, casting a hazy reflection of the spinning figurine and Emily's own curious green eyes. Jake looked pleased with himself. "I found it at Mrs. Potts' antique shop on Maple Street. She said it's probably from the 1950s or 60s. I know you like vintage things, and you always said you wished you had a music box like the one your grandma used to have." Emily nodded, a wash of memories coming back. Her grandmother had owned a similar music box. As a little girl, Emily would sit on her grandma's bed and wind it up over and over to watch the ballerina spin. That one had played the same lullaby, she recalled. The thought brought a lump to her throat. Grandma had passed away 6 years ago. Hearing the lullaby again now was like a gentle hello and goodbye, wrapped in one. "It's perfect. Thank you," she said, reaching across the table to squeeze Jake's hand. His palm was warm and a bit greasy from the fries, but she didn't mind. Her eyes were bright with gratitude. "Really, this means a lot to me." Jake's face softened. "You okay? You looked a little spooked for a second." Emily let out a small laugh. "No, I'm fine. It's just nostalgia, I guess. This tune reminds me of my grandma." She glanced down at the music box. The ballerina had slowed as the lullaby neared its end. For an instant, as the final note faded, Emily felt a peculiar chill, as if a breeze had swept through the diner, ruffling the hair on her arms. She rubbed away the goosebumps blooming there. "It's just a music box, and it's broad daylight," she told herself firmly. There was no reason a simple lullaby should send a shiver through her. Outside, a cloud slipped over the sun, dimming the light that fell across their table. The diner's overhead lights flickered once. Emily blinked in surprise, and the sunlight returned as quickly as it had gone. She exhaled, unaware she'd been holding her breath. Jake was oblivious to her momentary unease. He popped another fry into his mouth. "Glad you like it. I had a feeling you would. I know things have been weird since you moved back home after college. Thought it might cheer you up." Emily managed a genuine smile. "It does. It really does." She closed the lid of the music box gently. It gave a soft click, silencing the lullaby and tucking the ballerina away. Suddenly, the clatter of dishes and chatter of customers felt louder now that the tiny melody had ceased. They lingered a while, chatting about old classmates and summer plans. As they talked, Emily kept the music box close by her side on the seat. Occasionally her fingers drifted to it, tracing the carved flowers along its sides. Each touch of the smooth wood was oddly grounding, as if the box were anchoring her attention. In the back of her mind, the lullaby looped softly. When they finally stepped back out into the afternoon sun, Emily squinted against the brightness. The heat wrapped around her like a blanket, the asphalt of Main Street radiating warmth. She waved goodbye to Jake, who hopped into his rusty blue pickup truck with a promise to call her later. Emily tucked the music box securely under her arm as she walked down the sidewalk toward home. Willow Creek's main drag gradually gave way to the quiet residential lane where Emily lived. She passed picket fences and flower beds bursting with summer blooms. The scent of freshly cut grass mingled with the distant tang of gasoline from a lawnmower. Cicadas droned from the treetops, their chorus rising and falling in lazy waves. It was a short walk to her house. Emily lived with her parents in the same cozy white bungalow she'd grown up in on Pine Street. Returning here after college felt both comforting and a bit strange. She loved the familiar old porch that creaked underfoot and the sight of her mom's petunias overflowing their planters, but part of her still yearned for something beyond the quiet borders of Willow Creek. As she unlatched the low front gate, which gave a drawn-out squeal, the music box shifted in her grasp. The lid rattled slightly as if the mechanism inside had jostled. Emily adjusted her hold. The wood had warmed under her arm. Just as she stepped onto the porch, she thought she heard a tiny plink from inside the box, a single note chiming out of nowhere. She paused, heart skipping. The sound was so delicate she wondered if she imagined it. Holding the box up to her ear, she listened. The cicadas buzzed. A pickup truck rumbled on a distant street. But the box remained silent. Emily exhaled and gave a self-conscious smile to the empty porch. "Jumping at nothing," she murmured. "Probably just a leftover vibration in the music mechanism," she reasoned. Music boxes sometimes let out a stray note if they hadn't fully unwound. Shrugging it off, she pushed open the front door, which swung inward with a familiar whine. Inside, the house was dim and cool, a relief from the sun. Her mother must have left the AC running on low. Emily savoured the comforting blend of scents, lemony furniture polish and the faint aroma of her mom's earlier baking, blueberry pie if her nose was right. She headed down the hallway to her bedroom, the floorboards creaking softly beneath the carpet runner. In her room, afternoon light filtered through eyelet lace curtains, painting lacy shadows on the wooden floorboards. Emily set the music box on her dresser, placing it among her own assortment of treasures. A few framed family photos, a jar of sea glass, and a stack of paperback novels. The carved wooden box looked right at home among them, as if it had always been there. For a moment, Emily just stood there with her hand on the lid, the quiet ticking of her wall clock the only sound. The unease from the diner had dissipated, replaced by a simple contentment. It was a wonderful gift. Still, she felt a trace of that odd emotion from earlier, the feeling of homesickness for something she couldn't name. The lullaby's echo tugged at her heart. "It's just a music box, Em," she told herself, nearly chuckling at her own dramatic thoughts. With a last light pat on the lid, she left the box closed on the dresser and flopped onto her bed with a sigh. Evening settled in slowly. Emily spent it helping her mom with dinner, chopping vegetables while listening to her dad talk about his day at the hardware store. They ate together, and the normalcy of it, her dad's laughter, her mom's gentle teasing about the mess Emily had made of the carrots, grounded her. By the time night fell, the strange moment at the diner felt like a distant memory. That night, Emily curled up under her quilt with a mystery novel. Down the hall, she could hear the muffled drone of her parents' television tuned to the nightly news. The smell of her mom's pot roast lingered comfortingly in the cool air. She felt safe, if a bit restless. Around 11, her eyes grew heavy. She set aside her book, clicked off the lamp, and snuggled into the silence. In the darkness, her gaze drifted toward the dresser. She could just make out the silhouette of the music box, a darker square among the room's shadows. "Thank you, Jake," she thought sleepily, grateful for his friendship and the unexpected gift. As crickets chirped outside her window, Emily wondered drowsily about the music box's past life. Who had it belonged to before ending up in that antique shop? That was her last thought before sleep gently overtook her. Much later that night, long after Willow Creek's streets had fallen silent, Emily slept fitfully. The house was dark and still. A sliver of moonlight slipped through a gap in her curtains, casting a pale stripe across the floor and the base of her dresser, where the music box sat. Outside, crickets chirped in a steady lullaby of their own, and occasionally a lone car hissed down the distant highway. At just past 2 a.m., Emily's eyes fluttered open. She wasn't sure why she'd woken. The summer night was heavy and quiet. She lay there in the dimness, listening to the hum of the house. Then she heard it. A soft musical note, clear and singular, coming from the direction of her dresser. Her heart gave a curious little jump. Before she could sit up, another note followed, and another. A fragile melody began to unfurl in the darkness, slow, tinkling strains of Brahms's lullaby. Emily's breath caught. The music box was playing, even though its lid was closed, and she was certain she had not touched it since the afternoon. The tune was unmistakable, though strangely slow, each note ringing out with an ethereal sadness. She pushed herself upright, the quilt falling to her waist. In the feeble moonlight, she could see the shape of the music box across the room. The lid was shut, yet the lullaby continued, soft but haunting. Goosebumps prickled along her arms despite the warm night. A half-formed thought flitted through her mind. Was this a dream? She pinched herself lightly on the arm. It hurt. A reality check. Gathering courage, Emily swung her legs out of bed. Her bare feet touched the cool wooden floor. The boards gave a tiny creak under her weight as she took a tentative step forward. The melody pulsed gently through the hush. Lullaby and good night. The sweetness of it was at odds with the eeriness of it playing on its own. Her mouth was dry, tasting of sleep and a hint of fear. She approached the dresser slowly. The air felt colder the closer she got, raising goosebumps on her skin. Reaching out with a trembling hand, she unlatched the box and lifted the lid. The music abruptly stopped, cutting off mid-phrase. The sudden silence rang in Emily's ears. The ballerina inside popped up and twirled twice before coming to a standstill, as if nothing were amiss. Emily pressed her lips together, her pulse racing. She carefully touched the tiny figurine. It was still and cold. With a shaky sigh, she closed the lid once more. The latch clicked into place, and all was quiet. She stood there in her moonlit room, barefoot and shaking her head. There had to be some logical explanation. Perhaps she hadn't fully unwound it earlier, and it decided to release the last of its tension now. Yes, maybe that was it. The idea offered a scrap of comfort. Emily glanced around her room. Nothing else seemed out of place. The curtains rustled slightly with a draught. She noticed her window was open a few inches from earlier. Maybe a breeze had vibrated the mechanism. It was a stretch, but she clung to it. After a long moment, she returned to bed, leaving the lamp off. She kept her eyes on the music box across the room for a while, half expecting it to start up again. It didn't. Only the steady tick of her wall clock and the resumed chorus of crickets filled her ears. Eventually, exhaustion won out over adrenaline, and Emily drifted into a shallow, uneasy sleep, the light of the moon keeping the worst of her fears at bay. Dawn came and found Emily awake, dark circles under her eyes. She hadn't gotten much rest after the incident. The moment the sun crept over the horizon, she slid out of bed and went straight to the music box. It sat innocently on the dresser, looking exactly as it had the day before. Gingerly, she picked it up. The wood felt room temperature now, not inexplicably cold as it had in the night. Turning it over, she inspected the little brass key on the bottom. Perhaps she had left it wound a tiny bit. Determined to test it, Emily gave the key a full turn and flipped open the lid. The lullaby rang out at its proper speed, cheerful and bright in the morning light. The ballerina spun without any creepy overtones. Everything was normal. Down the hall, she could hear her mother starting to move about the kitchen. The comforting smell of brewing coffee wafted to her, cutting through her lingering anxiety. Emily inhaled deeply, letting the rich aroma steady her. She resolved not to mention the night's strangeness to her parents. Her practical-minded father would probably chalk it up to the house settling or some quirk of old gadgets. Her mother, who had a superstitious streak, might freak out and insist on some kind of cleansing ritual, which would only make Emily more nervous. Instead, she did the next sensible thing that came to mind. She called Jake. After all, he had given her the music box. Maybe he knew if it had any odd tendencies. She grabbed the cordless phone from her bedside table, a pastel yellow handset with a long antenna that crackled lightly. Punching in Jake's number from memory, she paced by her window. Outside, the lawn was silver with dew and a few early birds twittered in the maple tree. "'Lo?" came Jake's groggy voice after a few rings. "Jake, it's me, Emily," she said, keeping her voice low so it wouldn't carry down the hall. "Sorry to wake you." "It's all right," he mumbled, clearing his throat. "What's up? You sound weird." Emily pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the window. Something strange happened with the music box last night. There was a rustling as presumably Jake sat up in bed. Strange, how did it break? "No, not broken," Emily said. Her eyes drifted to the object in question. In the daylight, it was hard to believe it had given her such a fright, but she knew what she'd heard. It started playing by itself. In the middle of the night, while it was closed, it played that lullaby, Jake, slow, and it woke me up. A long pause. Then Jake, sounding more awake, asked, "Played by itself? Maybe it wasn't fully unwound?" "I thought of that," Emily replied, twisting a strand of her hair anxiously. "But Jake, it played a lot. Like a whole verse, not just a note or two, and it felt—" She hesitated, not sure she wanted to mention the cold or how scared she'd been. It felt off. Jake was silent for another heartbeat. When he spoke again, his tone was careful. "That is weird, I believe you. Old mechanical things can be unpredictable. But, look, do you want me to come over and check it out? Maybe we can see if something's loose inside." Relief and gratitude flooded Emily. He didn't think she was crazy. "Would you mind? I know it's early." Jake yawned audibly. "It's fine, I'll be there in a bit. We'll figure it out, Em." Less than an hour later, Jake's blue pickup rumbled up in front of Emily's house. The morning had already grown warm and bright. Emily greeted him at the door, feeling a wave of reassurance at the sight of her friend, toolbox in hand and resolve on his face. She led him directly to her room. Sunlight poured through the sheer curtains, illuminating the music box on the dresser. "So this is the troublemaker," Jake joked, trying to lighten the mood as he set his toolkit on the bed. Emily mustered a smile. "It looks innocent now, doesn't it?" Jake nodded, then got to work. He examined the music box carefully, turning it this way and that. "Mind if I open it up, just to see the mechanism?" "Go ahead," Emily said, hovering nearby with her arms hugged to herself. He found tiny screws on the bottom panel and used a small screwdriver from his kit to loosen them. The bottom came off with a slight pry, releasing a whiff of metallic, musty air. Inside, the workings of the music box gleamed, little brass gears and the silver cylinder studded with pins that plucked the comb to make the notes. Jake peered in with a furrowed brow. "Doesn't look rusted or anything, springs intact." He gently nudged a gear and the mechanism twitched, emitting a single high plink. Emily flinched at the sound, her nerves still raw. "Sorry," he murmured, casting her an apologetic look. He closed the box's bottom and tightened the screws again. "I didn't see anything obviously wrong." Emily sighed. That was both relief and disappointment. She accepted the closed music box from him. "Maybe it was just a fluke," she said quietly. She set it back on the dresser. Jake straightened, then something on the inside of the lid caught his eye. "Hey, what's this?" He opened the lid fully, causing the ballerina to spring up. Mercifully, he had not wound it so no music played. He pointed at the underside of the lid, just beneath the tiny mirror. "Letters?" Emily leaned in. Sure enough, scratched into the wood in very small, rough lettering were two initials, LT. They were faint, as though carved in haste with a pocket knife or something sharp. Her fingertips grazed the etching. A strange little tingle went through her. "LT," she murmured. "Probably the original owner's initials." Jake nodded thoughtfully. "Could be. Maybe a kid who owned it, or it was a gift to someone." Emily felt a prickle of curiosity. Who was LT? The music box was old. That person could be decades older now, or even passed away. She imagined a child long ago, inscribing their claim on this beloved object. The thought was oddly sobering. She closed the lid gently, the ballerina folding back into hiding. "Well, whoever LT is or was, they sure had a flair for the dramatic," she joked weakly, attempting to shake off the eerie feeling. "Maybe it really was just a mechanical quirk, like you said." Jake offered her a reassuring smile and began packing up his tools. "If it happens again, we can ask Mrs. Potts if she knows any history on it. But I bet it won't. Sometimes old things just act up once in a blue moon." Emily hoped he was right. She walked him back to the front door. The late morning sun was brutal outside, already heating the porch steps under their feet. They decided to get some sandwiches at the deli a few blocks over, partly to enjoy the day and partly to distract Emily from her lingering unease. As they strolled through town, they kept the conversation deliberately mundane. Upcoming plans for the Willow Creek Summer Fair, Jake's part-time job at the hardware store, a new band Jake was into. Emily laughed at Jake's jokes and tried to let the normalcy wash over her, but in the back of her mind she kept hearing that solitary lullaby in the dead of night and seeing those initials LT scratched in the wood. When Jake dropped her back home around lunchtime, Emily thanked him again. "I feel a lot better," she lied. "It was probably nothing." Jake gave her a gentle, knowing look. "You sure you'll be okay? I can swing by later if you want." "I'll be fine," she insisted. She didn't want to drag him further into what might just be her imagination running wild. "I'll call if anything, happens." He nodded and hopped into his truck. "Deal. And hey, try not to let it spook you. See you later, Em." As Emily watched him drive off, she already felt a knot tightening in her stomach. What if it wasn't a fluke? What if something truly strange was attached to that music box? The thought was both absurd and compelling. She shook her head and went inside, determined to occupy herself with chores and avoid dwelling on it. Still, even as she folded laundry and helped her mom bake in the afternoon, part of her remained on edge. If anything else odd happened with the box, she promised herself she wouldn't brush it off. She'd start digging into its past. Because if it wasn't just her imagination, then something, or someone, was reaching out through that lullaby, and she had to find out who. After she hung out with Jake that morning, Emily tried to go about her day as normally as possible. She tidied her room, did a few errands for her mom, and even settled onto the couch to watch a rerun of a feel-good 90s sitcom. The comfortable routines of a Saturday in Willow Creek helped dull the sharp edges of her anxiety. By afternoon, under the bright sun and familiar small-town stillness, the midnight incident almost felt like a dream she could dismiss. Almost. Emily couldn't entirely forget the way the music had spiraled out of the darkness or how real her fear had been. She found herself glancing at the music box frequently, as if expecting it to move or make a sound. It remained inert on her dresser, just a pretty knick-knack in the daylight. Jake stopped by briefly in the early evening to check on her, which she appreciated. They sat on the porch sipping iced tea, talking about nothing important. He could tell she was still rattled, but he didn't press her. He just kept her company for a while, which in itself was a comfort. When night fell again, Emily's nerves tightened. She placed the music box inside a drawer, as if hiding it away might prevent another scare. Feeling a bit foolish, she also left her bedside lamp on, casting a buttery glow in her room. Eventually, exhaustion from the restless previous night caught up with her. She fell asleep with the soft light still pooling across her quilt. That night she had no strange awakenings. No tinkling lullaby intruded into her dreams, no unexplained chill. She slept, fitfully at first, then deeply. By Sunday morning, Emily woke feeling more clear-headed. Sunlight peeked around the edges of her curtains, painting stripes on the floor. Birds chirped cheerily outside. She stretched, amazed that she'd slept through the whole night undisturbed. Relief battled with the remaining questions in her mind. Maybe, just maybe, it truly had been a one-time oddity. Still, she couldn't shake the initials LT from her thoughts. LT, carved by some previous owner. It felt like a clue begging to be followed. Emily remembered that her mother, who loved local lore and gossip, had once mentioned a story about a girl from town who went missing ages ago. She couldn't recall the details. She hadn't paid much attention at the time. But could it be related? A missing girl and a mysterious music box were likely unrelated, she reasoned. Yet the idea nagged at her. After breakfast, Emily found herself heading to the Willow Creek Library. If nothing else, the library's archives might satisfy her curiosity about who LT could be. She told her mom she was going to do some research for a personal project. Her mother, busy with Sunday chores, just reminded her to be home for dinner. The library was a small brick building off Main Street, quiet on a Sunday morning. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of old paper and a hint of mildew, an academic sort of smell that Emily had always oddly enjoyed. Mrs. Parker, the kindly librarian, gave her a surprised but warm greeting. Without delving into too many specifics, Emily asked for help finding newspaper articles from the mid-1970s about any notable events or missing persons. Parker's eyes lit with interest. Willow Creek didn't get many exciting research requests, and she led Emily to the back room, where the microfilm reader was kept. Before long, Emily was scrolling through spools of the Willow Creek Gazette from that era. The machine whirred softly as grainy newsprint flashed on the screen. She scanned headlines about local council meetings, a record heatwave, a county fair. Then her heart skipped when a headline jumped out. Local girl 8, missing, music box also gone. Her pulse quickened as she read the article. It was dated June 1975. 8-year-old Lily Thompson had disappeared one summer evening from her yard on Sycamore Street, just a few blocks from where Emily lived. The article noted that Lily's favourite possession, a small music box, was also missing from her room and presumed to have been with her when she vanished. Emily's finger trembled on the microfilm controls. Lily Thompson. LT. The music box. It had to be the same one. She continued reading, eyes darting over the text. Lily had lived with her father, Roger Thompson, a widower. The police had questioned him extensively, but eventually cleared him of suspicion due to lack of evidence and a solid alibi. He had been at work when Lily vanished. A neighbour, Frank Miller, was quoted as saying he'd seen Lily playing outside around 7 p.m. that night, shortly before she went missing. He claimed he was out running an errand when it must have happened. Another short piece followed up. Despite exhaustive searches and investigation, no trace of Lily was found. The town had held a vigil for her, and rumours had swirled. Some suspected the father privately, others wondered about strangers passing through. and a few pointed fingers at that neighbour Frank, simply because he'd been one of the last to see her. But there was no proof, only heartbreak. Eventually, the case went cold. Lily Thompson's name faded into local lore, a sad, unresolved mystery. Her family left town a couple of years later. Emily sat back, her heart hammering. The tiny image of a smiling, curly-haired girl accompanied the article. Lily holding a stuffed rabbit and grinning gap-toothed at the camera. That same face had, she was now sure, appeared in Emily's room as a frightened ghost. A wave of sympathy and sadness washed over her, mixed with chills of realization. The initials carved in the music box, the strange occurrences, the whisper of "help me" in the night. Lily had been reaching out. Clutching the photocopies she'd made of the articles, Emily thanked Mrs. Parker and left the library in a daze. The mid-morning sun was already hot and glaring, but she felt cold. It all made a horrible kind of sense now. The music box carried a dark energy because it had been present during Lily's tragic disappearance. Perhaps Lily's spirit was attached to it, unable to move on. Emily knew one thing for certain. She had to find out what truly happened to Lily Thompson. The ghost hadn't simply wanted to spook her. Lily wanted to be found. The words, "help me" and "find me" echoed in Emily's memory, whether they had been truly spoken or only felt. Her first step would be confronting Frank Miller. He was not only the neighbour who saw Lily last, but also evidently the person who had owned, or at least recently possessed, the music box. After all, he had sold it, likely through Mrs. Potts when clearing out things. Why had he kept Lily's music box all these years? Guilt? A twisted trophy? Either way, Emily needed to hear his side of the story, if he'd even talked to her. She dialed Jake from her car. He answered immediately this time. "Jake," she said breathlessly, "I know who LT is. Lily Thompson. She went missing in 1975. The music box was hers." Jake was stunned. "What? How did you—" "I'm at the library. I read the old newspapers. Jake, I think her ghost is in the music box. I think she's been asking me to help her." There was a pause. Then Jake replied, voice resolute, "Tell me everything." Emily did. She relayed the story of Lily's disappearance, the clues pointing to Frank Miller, and her own ghostly encounter. By the end, Jake was fully caught up and alarmed. "We have to go to Frank Miller's place," Emily said. She was already starting the car. "I need to confront him. What if Lily's body is still somewhere around there? The well, the woodshed, something they missed." "Emily," Jake cautioned, "this is basically 20 years old. If he did something, he's had a long time to cover it up." "I know," she said, her voice grim, "but he just put that music box out for sale. Maybe he's moving or his conscience got to him. If we scare him with what we know, maybe he'll slip up or confess." "We should loop in the police," Jake urged. "Without evidence, they won't rush on an old case. I do plan to tell them once I have something concrete," Emily assured him. "Will you come with me?" "Of course I will," he said without hesitation. They arranged to meet a block away from Frank's house within the hour. Emily swung by her home to pick up the music box. She felt Lily's presence might somehow be needed, and to grab a flashlight, just in case. Her mother noticed her hurried preparation and the intense look in her eyes. Emily deflected the concern with a half-truth. "Just following up on some antique hunting with Jake. Don't worry, I'll be safe." It wasn't entirely a lie. She certainly was hunting for something old. Justice for Lily. Sycamore Street was a leafy lane on the west end of town. Many of the houses there dated back to the 1940s, including the Miller house, which Emily recognized from the newspaper address. It was a small, weathered bungalow with peeling pale green paint and a sagging front porch. Clouds gathered as afternoon edged toward evening, lending the street a dull, anticipatory glow. The air was thick and warm, hinting that a summer storm was brewing. Emily parked around the corner. Jake was already waiting on the sidewalk. Together, they approached the house quietly. The neighborhood was still. Most people were indoors escaping the heat. Cicadas droned from the oaks, underscored by an occasional distant rumble of thunder. Clutching the canvas tote that held the music box, Emily felt her pulse quicken. She nodded at Jake, and he gave her an encouraging, if tense, smile. They climbed the porch steps. The wooden planks felt soft and mossy underfoot, and the air here had a mildewy shut-in smell. Emily raised a hand and knocked firmly on the screen door frame. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, through the mesh, the interior door creaked open. A man peered out, his figure blurred by the screen. Frank Miller. Emily's heart rate spiked, seeing the silhouette of him, a piece of the past standing in front of her. "Mr. Miller?" she called politely. "I'm Emily Bennett. This is my friend, Jake Lawson. Could we speak with you?" Frank opened the screen door a crack, just enough to be heard clearly. He was in his early 50s, with thinning hair and sallow skin. His eyes were wary, darting between Emily and Jake. "Do I know you?" he asked, voice guarded. "Emily, sir," her tone as respectful as she could make it while adrenaline sang in her ears. "It's about Lily Thompson." At that name, Frank Miller froze, the blood seeming to drain from his face. His eyes narrowed suspiciously. "I don't know anything about that," he said hoarsely and began to push the door shut. Desperate, Emily reached into her bag and pulled out the music box. She held it up so he could see it clearly through the screen. "Are you sure? This was hers, wasn't it?" His reaction was immediate. Frank's eyes locked on the music box and went wide with shock. All colour leached from his cheeks, leaving him ashen. He staggered back a half step, gripping the doorframe. Where did you get that?" he whispered. Emily stepped forward, heart pounding. "In town. You sold it, didn't you? It was Lily's." Frank looked as if he'd seen a ghost. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came. The silence stretched, charged with electricity. Suddenly, with a strangled cry, he slammed the interior door. The screen door rattled as he fled from view. "He's running!" Emily exclaimed, fear and urgency igniting inside her. Jake sprang off the porch. "I'll go around back," he shouted, bolting around the side of the house in case Frank tried to escape through a rear door. Emily, adrenaline surging, yanked open the screen door, which Frank had left unlatched in his panic. She dashed inside. The house was dim and musty, blinds drawn against the heat. Her eyes struggled to adjust. "Mr. Miller!" she called, her voice echoing in the cramped living room, packed with half-filled boxes and furniture draped in sheets. "Please wait. I just want to know what happened to Lily." A clatter sounded toward the back of the house. Emily followed, heart in her throat, down a narrow hallway. Suddenly behind her, a floorboard groaned. She spun too late. Something hard slammed into her shoulder with brutal force. Emily cried out as pain exploded through her, knocking her sideways into the wall. The music box slipped from her grasp and thudded to the floor. She collapsed next to it, dazed, her vision swimming. Frank loomed over her, breathing hard, his face twisted in a mix of terror and fury. In his hands, raised above her, he gripped an old baseball bat. "You should have left it alone," he snarled through gritted teeth. His whole body trembled. Emily's shoulder radiated agony, but she fought through it. Her mind raced for something to say. "What happened to Lily?" she gasped out. "I know you know, Frank. I know the music box was hers." Frank's expression flickered at the mention of Lily's name. Pain and guilt warred with anger. His chest heaved. He kept the bat poised, but his eyes suddenly brimmed with tears. I never meant," he choked, voice breaking. A distant boom of thunder rattled the house. Through the open front door, a gust of wind swept in, making the shadows jump. Emily seized the moment. "If it was an accident, just tell me," she pleaded, her voice raw. "She deserves that, don't you think, after all this time?" Frank's eyes squeezed shut. For an instant, Emily thought he might strike her just to end this, but instead he dropped the bat with a clatter. It rolled away on the wooden floor. He stumbled back, collapsing onto a covered armchair in the hallway. His face crumpled as sobs racked him. "It was an accident," he whispered, hands covering his face. She fell." Emily slowly picked herself up, cradling her throbbing shoulder. She nudged the bat further out of his reach with her foot, just in case. Outside, the rain finally began, drumming on the roof in a steady patter. Frank continued in a broken voice, words tumbling out in confession. "That night, Lily came over to show me her music box. She was excited, wanted to share the song. I told her it was getting late, she should be home. I was on my porch watching her leave when she tripped on the steps. She fell so hard, hit her head on the corner of the concrete slab. God, she was so still." His shoulders shook. I panicked. Everyone would assume I did something. I'd heard the gossip when her mother died, how folks looked at me funny just because I was a single man next door. I was terrified. So I carried her to the old well behind my shed and... He couldn't finish, burying his face in his hands. Emily pressed a hand to her mouth, tears of empathy and sorrow filling her eyes. Lily had died accidentally, but because of Frank's cowardice, the truth had been buried, literally, for 20 years. A flash of lightning lit the house through the front windows, followed by a sharp crack of thunder. In that flash, Emily saw a small, translucent figure standing a few feet behind Frank. Lily's ghostly form looked at Emily, her expression calm and sad. The temperature in the hallway plummeted, and Emily saw her breath puff out in a misty cloud. Frank sensed it too. He peeked through his fingers, saw the spectral child behind him, and let out a low, keening wail. "Lily, I am so sorry," he sobbed, twisting in the chair to face the apparition. "I never meant to hurt you. I'm sorry I didn't tell. I'm so sorry." Lily's ghost gazed at him steadily, then shifted her eyes to Emily. Their gazes met, and despite the chill in the air, Emily felt a warmth on her skin. A thank you, unspoken but understood. Lily's form grew fainter, the outline of the hallway visible through her. She gave Emily a small, grateful nod before fading completely, like mist in the sun. "Emily!" Jake's voice rang out urgently from the back door. A moment later he came rushing in, drenched from the rain, skidding to a halt when he saw the scene. Emily standing shaken, Frank slumped and crying. "It's okay," Emily managed, swiping at her wet cheeks. The tension in her voice melted into wariness. He told the truth, Jake. We need to call the sheriff." Frank didn't resist when, minutes later, Emily and Jake gently helped him up and escorted him to the front porch. The storm had tapered to a drizzle. Frank kept muttering apologies, to Emily, to Jake, to someone unseen. Emily dialed 911 on her cell phone with trembling fingers, her words measured and firm, as she reported a long-overdue confession to a decades-old crime. By the time the police arrived, sirens blaring through the quiet neighborhood, Frank Miller was a man emptied of fight. He led the officers to the old stone well behind his sagging shed and pointed wordlessly to it, tears streaming down his face anew. 2 deputies peered inside with flashlights, confirming the presence of what looked to be human remains. Emily stood under the porch overhang with Jake, a blanket from the police cruiser draped over her shoulders. Her whole body shivered now that the adrenaline was ebbing. The rain had stopped. In its wake, the air felt cleansed, smelling of wet earth and ozone. Red and blue lights flashed across the sodden yard as more cruisers and an ambulance arrived. She realized she was still clutching the music box, which Jake had retrieved from the hallway floor. Now, in the aftermath, it felt simply like an old box again. No eerie vibrations, no unbidden melodies. Emily ran her thumb over the brass latch, and for the first time since receiving it, felt no fear. As Frank was gently guided into a squad car, handcuffed, but treated with an understanding that his soul was already in deep torment, he caught Emily's eye through the open car door. "Thank you," he mouthed, before an officer closed him inside. It was a thank you for ending his nightmare, she realized. When the coroner's team eventually raised a small bundle of remains from the well, covered respectfully in a white sheet, a final clap of thunder sounded in the distance, as if marking the end of the storm. Emily's eyes overflowed then. Those were Lily's bones finally brought into the light of day. Jake put a supportive arm around her. She leaned into him and cried softly, tears of sorrow for a life lost and tears of relief that Lily had been found at last. Even through her tears, Emily noticed that the clouds were beginning to break apart, a hint of golden sky glowing in the west as the late sun prepared to emerge. It felt, in that moment, like Willow Creek itself was letting out a long-held breath. A week later, Lily's remains were laid to rest in Willow Creek Cemetery. Emily joined a handful of townsfolk to say a final goodbye to the little girl who had haunted their nights. She placed the music box, now forever silent, beside Lily's small gravestone as a parting gift. As the morning sun broke through the clouds, Emily felt a gentle warmth, a sense of peace washing over her. Lily's spirit was free at last. In the days that followed, the town found closure. Lily's father, though unable to attend, sent Emily a heartfelt message of gratitude. Frank Miller, overcome with remorse, accepted responsibility and would face due justice. Standing at the graveside with Jake's steady presence by her side, Emily realized that even the darkest mysteries could be brought into the light. Though tears of sorrow were shed, hope remained. Lily would never be forgotten, and the cycle of grief had finally been broken. As Emily left the cemetery, the sweet summer air felt brighter and the burden of the past lighter. The memory of a little girl's laughter would guide her into the future. Emily never looked at antique music boxes the same way again, but she knew one had changed her life forever. What began as a simple gift had become a haunting plea for justice, and she had answered it with courage and compassion. In uncovering the truth, Emily gave a lost soul peace and found her own strength in the process. Some gifts carry memories, others carry ghosts.
Every story has an end, but here, the mysteries never stop. Thank you for watching and being a part of this journey into the unknown. Your support keeps these stories alive, and there's plenty more waiting for you. We drop 3 new stories every week, so if you crave suspense, the unexplained and the downright chilling, make sure you're subscribed and ready for what's next. Until then, keep your lights on, your doors locked, and remember, some stories stay with you long after they're told.